Spaces looks different from leadership, corporations, or government. Psychedelic, spiritual, and sex-positive spaces require a power-aware, trauma-informed, and harm-reductive approach that, when applied intentionally, creates joy, inspiration, and transformation. The title of this talk right here is Accountability as a Liberation, Reducing Harm and Fostering Joy in the New Utopia. Please welcome to the stage, for the first time, we got canceled last year because of the rain, so we're really excited to have them back on stage. This is Mischa Byruck, right? Byruck, Mischa Byruck. Enthusiasm, thank you.
Right. I'm just going to do a quick test of this because we have a test. Does this make sense? Is this working for everybody if I hold my head up like this? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes, it works. Hold it more towards my mouth. How's that? Like this? All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's all take a breath together, shall we?
Hey, we just had a breath.
We just had a breath?
Yeah.
All right, let's do another one. Deep breath in.
Okay, let's see.
And let's all sync up a little bit more. Deep breath in. And we're going to do the last one, and my invitation is to let it out with an exhale that you can hear. Deep breath in. And shake off whatever's there. That was just as much for me as for you. I'm so happy to be here. I'll just say, this is actually my 20-year Burning Man anniversary. I've burned 7 times, but my first was 2004. It's really a joy to be here. I met a woman at a facilitator training a few years ago, and she was in tears because she was about to leave the environmental activist organization that she'd worked for a long time. The problem was that the head of the organization, a man in his mid-40s, had started sleeping with a different young woman who had recently joined up to volunteer. Was their relationship abusive? Nope, not at all. They both seemed really happy. And besides, at this organization, volunteers and organizers routinely partied together and slept with each other. But now there was this dynamic that she couldn't abide. She felt unsafe, a clenching in her stomach that was all the more troublesome because she couldn't fully rationalize it. The other members of the organization seemed to feel the same as she did. Everyone was uneasy, but they couldn't say why. After all, the relationship seemed consensual. And who were they to challenge anyone's sexual decisions? The relationship was consensual, but it was destroying the organization. My name is Mischa Byruck. I'm a men's sexual integrity coach, and I support clients who have done harm around sex to reconnect to their integrity and take accountability. I'm also the consent education partner of Bonobo Network, the Bay Area's premier sex-positive community, the consent education partner for Plura, the dating app for edge of culture communities, and the official accountability referral partner of the Consent Academy. My organizational clients include the International School of Temple Arts, ISTA, Kink.com, Dance Safe, and Sacred Sons. Over the past 5 years, really 7 years, I've worked one-on-one with over 100 men, most of them leaders in their communities, and supported them to shift old patterns, repair with the people they've harmed, and return to their communities better, safer, and wiser. And today I'm going to talk about how leaders cause harm with sex and what to do about it. So strap in, because I'm taking us pretty deep into accountability, justice, and sexual harm.
Woo!
When I talk about my work, people tend to tighten up in their bodies. So I encourage you to return to those breaths if that's aligned for you. If you notice your heart racing, if you notice something coming up. There'll be time for questions as well at the end. But notice that even talking about this, even hearing someone else talk about this can bring up a lot. I got into this work because I too have created harm with my sexuality. Misreading cues, misattuning, moving too fast, failing to recognize my own power and influence in ways that have caused harm. And I've seen firsthand how prevalent sexual harm is, how much of it is accidental, and hopefully how preventable so much of it can be. And I am driven, as so many of my fellow sex and consent educators, sexual harm advocates, restorative justice practitioners, and counselors are, by a vision of a sexually liberated society that holds accountability as its core value. I also personally practice all the tools I'm going to describe today. So to begin with, I welcome any and all feedback about my speech, but also just about anything. And I commit to receiving it with gratitude and non-defensiveness. If you think I'm dangerous and you want to warn others, I invite you to report me via my website to my external accountability supervisors, Angel Adioha, the head of Folsom Street Fair, and Marsha Baczynski, the author of Creating Consent Culture, at evolve.men. I'm also 3 years sober and drug-free, a member of Chokmah Halev, a Berkeley synagogue, and I'm currently completely celibate. Before I actually begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the people that my clients have harmed. I invite you, if you will, to close your eyes for a moment. I'd like to acknowledge those who have lost sleep, tossing and turning with the image of my clients in their heads. Those who have been forced to leave the room when my clients have entered. Who have been abandoned by their friends because my clients were more popular or more powerful. Who have experienced fear and pain during sex as a result of my clients' actions. Those who have shed tears of rage at the impunity with which my clients move through the world. Let us acknowledge these people. Let us acknowledge you. Let us honor everyone who has been harmed by sex. Thank you. Thank you. So my invitation right now is to raise your hand if you have been impacted by the abuse of power around sex in one of your communities. Look around. The men called out through the Me Too movement were originally in mainstream industries and large institutions, film, news, politics, business. But Me Too has also seen the heads of many countercultural organizations brought to task for abusing power around sex. The Neo-Tantra schools, Source Tantra and Agama Yoga, Bay Area sex-positive communities, Interchange, Organ House, sex-forward company One Taste, the Center for Consciousness Medicine, Buddhist meditation communities, yoga communities, Burning Man camps, all have been impacted by accusations of assault and abuse of power around sex. And this is to say nothing of dozens of called out sex educators, polyamory experts, and authors, and the hundreds of sex-positive dance and polyamory communities, communes, group houses, and other intentional spaces that have been torn apart by sexual harm. Sexual harm is pervasive across the world, but I believe that it is worse when it occurs in sex-positive spaces. And exponentially worse when the leaders of these spaces are the ones causing it. I'm talking about the organizers, figureheads, directors, and educators at yoga retreats, dance events, tantra schools, swingers clubs, activist conclaves, techie co-living spaces, kink dungeons, transformational growth conferences, polyamory groups, psychedelic journeying communities, and of course, large-scale countercultural events like concerts, festivals, and Burning Man. Spaces that celebrate kink, queerness, and alternative sexual expression are, for many, a refuge from a mainstream world that has told us that we are too loud, too pushy, too slutty, and too weird. We come to spaces like these, to spaces like Burning Man, to free ourselves from the shame-based repression of our forebears. We come to feel safe. And when we come, it is often from a place of scarcity, hunger, or vulnerability. To be in sex-positive space is to take risks with our bodies, our insecurities, our triggers, our traumas, and our reputations. And we put the energetic burden of these risks onto the organizers of such spaces. We rely on them to keep us safe. So when sexual harm happens within these kinds of spaces, it's often even more disappointing, even more harmful than it is in the mainstream world. And when the leaders of these spaces are the ones doing the harm, the disappointment is magnified into betrayal. Trust is shattered, communities reel, and everyone points fingers. I want to invite you into one more exercise. And the invitation again is to close your eyes. I invite you to imagine my clients. They're all men, and almost all of them are in positions of leadership. At times, some of them have been creepy, repeatedly bothering women or pushing for sex, ignoring or steamrolling past soft no's, being sexually aggressive, or sometimes even directly violating consent. Others have simply misused their own power, vouching for the wrong man or taking advantage of their celebrity in a creepy way. Are you imagining them? Now, if you're willing, with your eyes still closed, please pause and turn your attention to yourself and to a time that you hurt someone. Remember the feelings of guilt and shame, the fear of being discovered, the fear of being the villain, the fear that you're a bad person. Now think of the worst possible interpretation of your actions. The story that disregards all context, that flattens nuance, that denies you the full and complex birthright of your humanity. Imagine now that everyone around you had heard about it or had heard something even worse about you. Imagine literally that the people around you were knowing this and were judging you right now. And take a breath. And now I invite you to soften, to see the humanity of my clients as you would want people to see your own, to see their pain and their vulnerability, their vast complexity. I invite you to remind yourself that which I judge in others exists inside me as well. And come out of it gently. Thank you. And thank you for sticking with me so far. I talk a lot about accountability, and it's a misunderstood term. The most elegant definition I've found comes from Danielle Sered, the founder of Common Justice, which is one of the most prominent restorative justice organizations in the world. She writes, "True accountability is a set of actions as equal and opposite as possible to the wrongful actions committed by the person who caused harm. Accountability is the active exercise of power in the opposite direction of harm. As such, it is a force for healing." The vision that I mentioned earlier of a sexually liberated society that holds accountability as its core value was originally articulated by intersectional feminist pioneers like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, and prison abolition movement thought leaders like Adrienne Maree Brown and Mia Mingus and Shira Hassan. And I want to acknowledge them, as well as the way that I'm influenced by the harm reduction movement for drugs, by the mythopoetic men's movement, and experts on supporting men's transformation in a patriarchal society. So here's my thesis. Sex-positive leaders need a unique set of tools to reduce harm. And these tools are out there, being developed by hundreds of conscientious communities who are figuring out how to love each other more safely. And that chief among these tools is to create a culture of accountability with an understanding of how sex and power can interact to create harm. In my explorations of the harm that leaders do with sex, I've been particularly inspired by the pioneering work of Oxford philosophy professor Amiya Srinivasan, who writes about the ways that power-imbalanced sex can be consensual, but also systemically damaging. It's often the case that my clients are actually not violating consent at all, but rather are neglecting their responsibilities as leaders in a way that leads to broader harm. I want to say this again. The sex is consensual, and it's the people around it that are the ones harmed. So let's go back to that environmental organization. When the executive director started sleeping with the new woman, here are a few of the dynamics that began to play out. Some of the people in the organization experienced jealousy of the leader's new lover. Others began to realize that their leader had now become their romantic competition. Either way, many began to question his ability to make impartial judgments about assigning responsibilities and found themselves vigilantly ensuring his new lover wasn't receiving extra privileges or cushy assignments. Others, especially the femmes, started to feel like prey. Like, was sex and flirtation now expected of them in order to get ahead in this organization? There was resentment at being forced to wonder each morning before coming in to volunteer, how much makeup should I put on? Am I now being judged by how much I appeal to the leader? For others, a more protective instinct kicked in. They feared the young woman would be hurt and then discarded. Their workplace had somehow become centered on their leader's love life. Will this relationship work out? What if they break up? Will she be forced to leave? They didn't want to stand in judgment of the way he dated, but it was unavoidable. And none of these questions were named, and none of them were answered. And in that silence, the people in the organization started to lose trust in their leader. Their story became, he's just here for his own benefit, taking his pick of the women, and he'll discard this one like he did his last girlfriend. New questions emerged. Is this community a sexual free-for-all? A meat market in which those with the most power have their choice of those with the most conventional beauty, and in which the youngest and conventionally prettiest have the most direct access to power through sex? And further, doesn't all of this belie the progressive philosophies that brought us all together in the first place? People found it harder to trust their leader to deal with other sex-related harms fairly. After all, after displaying such ignorance about the impact of his own sexual choices, how could he be trusted to adjudicate fairly if one employee harmed another, especially if that harm also involved sex? And so the story became still worse. Since our leader is willing to risk the inevitable emotional fallout when he dumps this young woman for the next one, it's clear that he doesn't really care about hurting us, the people who have placed our trust in him. And so the space was disrupted. There was infighting and gossip, and yet because the culture was supposed to be sex positive and the relationship was consensual, the leader refused to shift course or examine his actions in context. The parties and events continued, but they had a different energy now. People began to analyze the leader's every move. The affectionate hugs and flirtations that had previously felt endearing now appeared sinister. People were on guard, unable to relax, and distracted from the work that they were there to do. The harm was done, and so they left. The three lessons that I take from this story and from the many, many others like it that I have heard are these. First, power imbalanced sex often hurts the people around it, even if those involved are consenting. Second, distrust spreads quickly and widely within sex-positive space, even, and maybe even especially, when it's a group of friends. And third, people's sense of safety in a sexual space comes, first and foremost, from the knowledge that the leaders of that space will prioritize the health of the collective over their individual desires. How y'all doing? I told you things could get heavy. Well, let's take a breath together. Deep breath in. Thank you. We're coming to the meat, which is all about the ways that leaders in sex-positive spaces can create cultures of accountability to reduce sexual harm. And fortunately, I've been blessed to see many examples of power-aware, trauma-informed, and joy-inducing leadership in sex-positive spaces. The leaders that I'm thinking of are not perfect, but they tend to have in common the following skills. They navigate power well. They don't get defensive when they get called out or in or whatever. They know how to take accountability when they fuck up. They proactively seek out feedback. They have someone they are accountable to. They're open about past harms. And they have their own set of rules that govern their actions that go beyond any organizational code of conduct and which makes sense for them. These leaders and their communities are not immune to harm, but they are resilient to harm. And they are far more resilient than those that indulge in the myth that harm doesn't happen here, or it's only done by bad people. The communities that insist on good vibes only, that ignore or dismiss anyone who raises hard topics as an annoyance, or on the flip side, who are so unwilling to hold the complexities and liabilities of harm that they immediately eject anyone who may have done some, ironically then contributing to a culture of fear in which more harm happens because people are more afraid to report it. Let's dive into the first of these three skills, power awareness. When I say power, I'm talking about formal power like being the boss or the landlord, but also identity-based power through race and class and gender and ability, as well as more abstract privileges like beauty or charisma or confidence. And I'm also talking about the power of not holding as much trauma in your body as the person across from you. And contextual power and social rank, being the most educated person in the room, having a great reputation, having lots of friends, having access to the drugs or the next cool thing. And what I've seen again and again is that it's not actually the presence of power that creates problems. It's the delusional conceit that power's not there. That the boss shouldn't have to act any differently just because he's the boss. That the most sexually experienced person in the room shouldn't ever have to show restraint. That the party host need never exercise additional discernment. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen good-looking, well-off, charismatic, influential, straight, cis, white men who are genuinely shocked that they held so much influence over the people around them. Surprised that people might be dramatically impacted by even their most offhand remarks. And humbled by the way that others in sex might defer to them, silently accept their desires, and avoid disappointing them even as they cause harm. Strong leaders, however, tend to understand power, accept its inevitability, and wield it well. They have a sense of where they might inadvertently intimidate others and make it a habit to correct for the power distinction where they can, and to not take advantage of it when they can't. One way they defang power differentials is simply by acknowledging them, which establishes trust and fosters connection by creating a shared reality. These leaders are able to name the power dynamics at play when it's called for, and they do so gracefully and skillfully, sometimes out loud, in order to create a safer environment around them. Here's what it looks like. I recognize that it might be challenging to critique me since I'm the organizer of this party, so I really appreciate any thoughts you're willing to share. Or, I'm the head of this organization and many of you work for, so I'm not gonna be the one in charge of distributing drugs, as that can create an obligation dynamic which is really dangerous in a sexual context. Moving on to non-defensiveness, this one's really critical. Leaders I admire invite feedback by demonstrating that when they get it, they will respond with grace and humility and a serious commitment to change, rather than shutting down the person who corrected them, appeasing them and then ignoring them, or going into denial or deflection. Defensiveness is particularly destructive in a leader because it signals to everyone that there's no willingness to change, that critique will be received as attack. It's already immensely uncomfortable to speak truth to power, but knowing that giving you feedback will result in anger radically reduces the likelihood that anyone will tell you anything. And honestly, it's an accepted trope, actually, among my colleagues in sexual harm prevention, that the way someone reacts to being told they caused harm tells us most of what we need to know. Effective leaders practice non-defensiveness by seeking out feedback about even the tiniest offenses and treating that feedback seriously, right? They don't wait for the big one. It can look as simple as, thank you for telling me that I harmed you. I'm gonna take some time to process this. I recently worked with a major sexuality leader who had propositioned one of his assistants and deeply harmed her. Before he found me, he turned what could have been a relatively small course correction into a multi-year-long process ordeal because he was so resistant and defensive when his assistants and eventually others in his community told him that he was doing harm. When he finally did come to me, we zeroed in on developing this skill, and he really got it. In addition to the accountability and restoration work he's done, he's since returned to teaching with a rigorous rule against such flirtations and a much thicker skin. And he now receives even the saltiest feedback with seriousness and equanimity and gratitude, which of course sets the people around him at ease. And the last skill I want to talk about here is accountability itself. By a show of hands, how many people here have seen a leader called out for doing harm whose immediate reaction made the whole thing worse? It's very easy to do a public mea culpa in a way that does more harm. It's very easy to weaponize an apology, even inadvertently. It's very easy to take accountability in a way that does more harm. I cannot stress this enough. And it further erodes trust and creates more drama. Therefore, one of the most fundamental skills, perhaps the most fundamental, is to know how to take accountability, restore integrity, and communicate a genuine apology to people you've harmed and to the community you're in charge of. For leaders, this means making private and public statements that actually name the harm, acknowledge the impact, and list specific actionable things that they are doing to prevent similar harm in the future. I harmed you. It was selfish. I harmed you, and I could have done better. I could have wielded my power more consciously, but instead I choose to pursue my own agenda. I disrespected you and the community I serve. It was wrong. I'm sorry. And here's what I'm doing to prevent it from happening again. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that leaders be able to take accountability well. Truly, if the choice was between learning this skill and having an official code of conduct, taking a consent course, and bringing in an outside legal consultant, I would choose this. Any system or process can be dodged. Any rule can be danced around if the energy of accountability is not present. So far, so good? All right, we navigate power well, we don't get defensive, and we know how to apologize, right? Good skills to develop. But smart leaders of sex-positive spaces go beyond skills. They deploy specific social technologies to mitigate their own harm and convey a sense of safety and trust to the people they are responsible for. The first of these technologies is the voluntary supervisor. Many of the leaders I work with, especially in sex-positive spaces, exist outside formal power structures. They don't have bosses, they work in unregulated industries like coaching or psychedelic-assisted therapy, or they're the heads of informal and underground communities. There's no built-in accountability system, right? The smart ones know, though, that just being able to point out power dynamics isn't enough. No matter how many courses they take and books they read, there will be perspectives and insights that they will miss. This is where voluntary supervision comes in. When basically a leader finds someone they respect, ideally with identities and backgrounds distinct from their own, and essentially relinquishes some of their power and autonomy to them. In the same way that many therapists have supervisors or executive directors of nonprofits have oversight boards. These voluntary supervisors are people they check in with regularly to review challenging situations. They're not just advisors, they have the power to tell a leader to stop organizing events, to pause teaching or working with clients, to withdraw even from leadership roles, to take specific areas of work off their plate, to implement specific policies in their organization, to take supplemental classes, to go into therapy, even to take a break from attending high-risk social events or engaging in high-risk sexual activities. There's an example. A religious leader I know is a single man, recently divorced, queer, and actively dating and going to sex parties. When he started at his current religious post, he immediately secured an ethics advisor, who he meets with twice a month, to review his dating life and ensure he's managing his power and influence wisely and for the good of the community. This works. The next tool is called, it's all about seeking feedback proactively, and it's called a call for experiences. Basically, a leader makes an announcement requesting that anyone who's had a negative experience with him share it. Not with him directly, but with a small group of people, ideally themselves respected leaders with diverse backgrounds. That group then gets together, reviews the responses, and identifies patterns that they then relay back to the leader in a way that is completely anonymous for the people who shared. This kind of process is often part of a larger accountability process for someone after they've done harm. And it's a useful way, even without that, to demonstrate an interest in understanding your own patterns. I did it once. It is incredibly frightening. An example of this, though, is one man I recently worked with who had gotten kicked out of a number of his communities and was being prevented from starting his own. So he paused and stepped back and launched a public call for experiences with me and a few others. I worked with some of his community members to summarize the feedback, and after 6 months of work on himself based on the feedback of over a dozen people, he was able to put out a public restoration and shift some of the ways he was acting. He was authentically repentant, repaired where he could, and his bravery and self-examination earned him back a lot of the trust he had lost. He's in the process of reintegrating into his communities now, humbled by his own patterns. Finally, we come to preemptive disclosure. One of the most powerful ways to lead is by letting business partners, students, podcast hosts, volunteers, colleagues, and any others in your orbit or who are staking their reputation to yours know about harm you've done, especially in your recent past. I have seen teachers who include this in an upfront statement before they start a class or workshop. Hey, I caused harm last year, I was in an accountability process about it, and this is what happened, right? Before I teach. I've seen participants at Burning Man who joined a new camp and proactively let their camp lead know about having done harm in a previous camp and what happened. I've seen therapists who let prospective clients know about a past breach of integrity and how they handled it. It's the accepted practice in many of the rope circles or kink and rope circles that I know also for bottoms to ask a new top, tell me about a time that you fucked up, tell me about a time you did harm. This is a good practice to have. Right? To normalize that we'll make mistakes, to normalize that having hurt people, having done harm does not make us bad people. Yeah. Now, sharing anything about your past is always a controversial decision. It's a legal liability, or it can be, and in many situations can be dangerous to your reputation. And that said, I've also seen people keep the skeletons hidden and then have it come back to bite them. Turned down for jobs, for housing, or rejected from intentional communities, even after years. This isn't a one-size-fits-all practice. None of them are. Every situation is different, and they all require human connection, relationality, and conversation. The last area to address is about how leaders go about ensuring, as I have described before, that they are placing the health of the collective over their own individual desires. The most basic and obvious way, of course, is for leaders to abstain from sex with anyone they're in any way a leader of, but that can get really complicated, right? So the most creative leaders come up with their own standards, right? Based on recognizing their own patterns and their own weak spots. One person I know has a consistent practice of asking his peers to review a potential sexual connection for negative potential impact before engaging in it. One man I know, a prominent head of a sex party organization, has a rule of never hooking up with anyone who's been around for less than a year. This one, for instance, might have been supportive of the environmental nonprofit. A woman I know has the rule of thumb that she doesn't share sexual energy with anyone who still sees her as a leader or influencer first, rather than a whole-ass human. Some people's rule is never to initiate. Others never combine sex with drugs. Others use a waiting period, 6, 12 months before hooking up with anyone they had or have power over. These rules might sound arbitrary or inadequate, but people are complicated, and they tend to break rules. I don't know about you, but they tend to break rules imposed on their sexual freedom, especially by others. What works is for leaders to develop a deep sense of their own integrity, right? Like their own values, and to understand the power that they have over others, and to use that understanding to drive their own accountability practices. Okay. This is my conclusion. We've talked about how easy it is for leaders to do harm in sex-positive spaces, and some of the ways that smart leaders are adjusting their practices to reduce harm and role model accountability. I'm so grateful to you all for sticking with me. If I'm going to leave you with one idea, with one concept, one tool above all others, it is the importance of accountability, the active exercise of power in the opposite direction of harm. The truth is, being a leader in a sex-positive space is incredibly difficult. After all, so much of sex is about finally letting down our guard, right? But when leaders let their guards down, others tend to put theirs up. Their natural instincts and desires, which they, like us, have fought so hard for the right and the courage and the freedom to express authentically and without shame, can so easily cause those around them to feel less safe. Meanwhile, people will inevitably project all of their biases and prejudices and traumas onto their leaders in ways that none of us completely understand or predict or control. I believe in sex-positive spaces and communities as fundamentally liberatory projects. They have been immensely impactful to me and to so many people I love. But they can also too easily re-traumatize the people in them, fostering trust and then shattering it, and recreating the same white supremacist, patriarchal, misogynist, rape culture dynamics that we're all trying to escape. I have found it both true and useful to see the harm we do as rooted in systems of oppression. I have pushed for emotionless sex in the past because, in part as a man and like so many others, I have been raised to evaluate my worth based on the notches on my belt. And somewhere along the way, I lost the parts of my humanity that would immediately recognize such actions as harmful. I've needed lots of coaching and therapy and corrective experiences to return to my humanity. But most of all, I've needed accountability. It's only through accountability for the harm I cause under patriarchy and white supremacy, without shame or blame or excuses, that I've begun to free myself of the alienation and superiority and entitlement of modern white manhood. It's only through accountability that I've ever felt free of the fear and guilt and shame and self-loathing of those who do harm. And it's only through accountability that my clients ever really lift from their shoulders the weight of community condemnation. And it is only, of course, by living accountability, preventing harm where I can, owning it when I can't, and constantly striving to improve, that I feel secure in my leadership, that I feel secure to stand here today. For when we take accountability, without evasion or minimization or deflection. We heal rifts, not just in our communities and in our relationships, but in the fabric of our society. And when leaders pursue accountability as a way of being, they create healing not just for the people they've harmed, but for everyone whose lives they touch. Accountability is liberation for all of us. The incomparable Bell Hooks, in her book All About Love, called on us to center what she called the practice of love within the context of community. And truly, what could be more loving than taking accountability for the harm that we do to each other? Fucking up and then fixing it well actually fosters trust, the key element that was destroyed at that environmental volunteer group, and that clearly, despite the shared mission and all the sex parties, wasn't really there to begin with. The more we trust each other, the more resilient our spaces become. So many communities break up after their leaders refuse to take accountability for harm. We cancel each other, we abandon or eject each other from community, or we get lost in a morass of justice processes, investigations, mediators, and recrimination. That's why I believe that the key to community resilience is not process or procedure. It's for everyone, starting with our leaders, to authentically care about accountability and to practice it themselves. Leaders who consistently deepen their power awareness and have the humility to know they can't see everything, who preempt the inevitability of harm by setting up systems for themselves to support their own integrity and know how to deal with harm as it arises and are not afraid to face it, foster trust, and inspire others. And this, my friends, is how we build the new utopia. We liberate our understanding of justice just as we have liberated our sexualities. Again, we liberate our understanding of justice just as we have liberated our sexualities. We balance the ecstasy of sexual freedom with the sobriety of skillful prevention and repair. We accept that sexual liberation brings with it a massively increased potential for harm, and therefore immense new responsibilities for those who so bravely step forward to hold the spaces in which our liberation can occur. We humble ourselves before the immensity of the power that we have when people expose the most vulnerable parts of themselves to us. And we accept that our leaders will fall down on this path. We acknowledge that power is everywhere, and we learn to dance with it with nuance and grace. We center the possibility of change without letting anyone off the hook. We insist on complexity. We reduce harm. Another world is possible, and I'll see you there.
Thank you so much. Well, we have a few minutes still, so this is the point of the series here.